Hi, everyone. I'm Melissa, and for my presentation, I'll be talking about English in India. More specifically, I'll be examining the history of the English language as it made its way through the subcontinent. I'll talk about what the language landscape looked like in India before English made its official appearance in the early 17th century, share a brief history of the linguistic policies of the East India Company and the British Raj, and follow English from the offices of colonial clerks to its starring role as one of India's constitutionally mandated official languages. So let's go ahead and dive in. Thanks to everyone in advance for watching, and I hope you find some of this interesting. But first, because I'll take literally any opportunity to work a bit of Old English into a project, here's something just for fun. When do you think English was first spoken in India? Given some of our reading this semester, we'd all be forgiven for assuming that the English language showed up sometime in the 17th century. But it turns out that the very first time English was spoken on the subcontinent may have been more than 700 years before the first traders from the East India Company made it ashore. Archaeologist Dr. Caitlin Green has written a fascinating account of the envoy sent by the Anglo-Saxon King Alfred to India in 883. Alfred sent the men, Sigohelm and Athelstan, to offer alms at the shrine of St. Thomas. The event was noteworthy enough to be included in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. How exciting to see the word India so clearly written in an Old English text. Unfortunately, it's unlikely that this pilgrimage had any lasting linguistic effects, but it's fun to dream about the possibility that there's been a long-lost Old English-speaking community in Kerala all these years. So, I'm going to take just a brief moment here to go over some important people, places, and institutions that we'll encounter in the coming slides. The first player in our story is the Mughal Empire. The Mughals dominated the Indian subcontinent from 1526 to 1857. Around 1707, at the height of its glory, the Mughal Empire controlled land stretching from Afghanistan to nearly the southern tip of India. This is who was in control when the British first arrived in India. The British, of course, weren't the only Europeans poking around the Indian Ocean. The Portuguese, French, and Dutch were also active in India, and even little Denmark established a short-lived presence there. English ships regularly captured Portuguese vessels off the western coast of India and drained them of their gold and spices. Eventually, the Portuguese just gave up their possessions in India and went elsewhere. Historically, there's nothing the English and the French enjoy doing more than going to war with one another, and that tradition remained alive and well in India. French and English armies skirmished on the eastern shores of India for years until the French and their allies were finally and soundly defeated at the Battle of Plassey in 1757. Next, we have the British East India Company. Remarkably, India was not colonized by a state power, but rather by a small, private company of English traders who were granted a charter by Queen Elizabeth I in 1600. For more than 250 years, they operated with impunity in India, first as small-time traders and investors in coastal ports. 3 are marked in red on this map: the northwestern city of Surat, Calcutta in the northeast, and Madras in the south, before eventually becoming one of the largest and wealthiest corporations in existence. And it's via the East India Company that the English language gained a foothold in India. The British Crown nationalized the company in 1857 after it failed to contain a massive uprising, and therefore any mention of the English, or the British, after 1857 refers to Crown rule in India, which is often referred to as the British Raj. The Raj ruled India for 90 years before finally granting India its independence in 1947. I also want to talk about the pre-colonial language landscape in South Asia. I made this little chart to illustrate the various languages that English came into contact with when it first arrived in India. Hindustani and Persian are the most important languages to be aware of here. Hindustani was one of the most commonly used vernaculars in large parts of the subcontinent, followed by Bengali and South Indian languages like Tamil. Hindustani is what we know today as Hindi and Urdu. These 2 languages are simply 2 different registers of Hindustani. Hindi and Urdu are by and large the same language, but they use a different script and have different influences when it comes to poetic or religious language. The languages are mutually intelligible, and speakers of the two have no real difficulty understanding one another. You can think of these languages like you would British and American English. Same language, slightly different seasoning. The other key language here is Persian. Persian, specifically Indo-Persian, was the administrative language of the Mughal Empire. You want a job at court? You need to speak Persian. You want to work as one of the Mughals' famed revenue administrators? You need Persian. Persian was to the Mughal Empire what French was to Norman England, a language escorted in by invaders that became a prestige language, necessary if you wanted any kind of work from or relationship with royalty, the court, and so on. In fact, Persian was so important in the Mughal Empire that the East India Company maintained it as an official administrative and judicial language for almost 200 years. English was first properly introduced in India in the early 1600s, and by the mid-1900s, it had risen so high that it was named an official language in the constitution of the newly independent Indian state, even though it was, and remains today, a language spoken by only a small minority of India's citizens and has no indigenous connection to the region. So how did it get there? In his introduction to the book Language in South Asia, Indian-American linguist Biraj Kachru says that the growth of English in the region should be seen as occurring in 4 overlapping phases: exploration, implementation, diffusion, and institutionalization. The exploration phase was marked by the introduction of England's first official ambassador to the Mughal court of Jahangir, Sir Thomas Roe. Roe was appointed by King James I and served as ambassador for nearly 4 years, returning to England in 1619. Roe notoriously had severe linguistic difficulties during his time in Jahangir's Agra court. Unlike some of the unofficial ambassadors who'd come before him, Roe never bothered to learn Persian. Instead, he communicated with the emperor via a comically long chain of translators. In the East India Company's early years, British missionaries operated more or less freely in India. They ran schools, operated presses, and translated Christian texts into vernacular languages. However, by 1765, worried that religious interference by British Christians would cause friction with locals and threaten their contracts, the company put an end to evangelical proselytizing. This prompted furious reactions from prominent evangelicals and religious societies back home, and the evangelical movement spent the next few decades petitioning to be allowed back into India. Their so-called pious clauses, which were amendments that Christian activists wanted added to the East India Company's charter, circulated in Parliament in 1793 and again in 1813. The first attempt was unsuccessful, but the watered-down 1813 version was eventually taken up, and missionary activity and the English education that went along with it resumed once again, albeit with stringent checks and restrictions. The missionary debate produced some particularly choice and often somewhat hilarious sound bites. Here we have an excerpt from the first proposed pious clause of 1793. It's patronizing in that special colonial way and requests provision for those who want to go to India to, quote, introduce the native inhabitants to useful knowledge. How nice of them. William Wilberforce, usually known for his liberal anti-slavery sentiments, comes in with a whopper. He says, our religion is sublime, pure, and beneficent. Theirs is mean, licentious, and cruel. But my favorite line here is the response from the East India Company. They said, the sending of Christian missionaries into our eastern possessions is the wildest, maddest, most expensive, and most unwarranted plan that was ever proposed by a lunatic enthusiast. By the early 19th century, the implementation of Britain's English policy was in full swing. In 1835, the Governor-General of the East India Company, Lord William Bentinck, decided to drastically change the way education was funded in the country. The company's 1813 charter required the allocation of 100,000 rupees, the purchasing power of which would have been enormous, to be used for education. For over 20 years, this money was used to fund traditional education in India, meaning the teaching of traditional Indian subjects in Sanskrit, Hindustani, and Persian. Many people were of the mind that this type of education wasn't useful, and for many years a battle waged between two groups, the Anglicists, who wanted to institute an English language Western curriculum, and the Orientalists, who value traditional ways. However, the Anglicists made their voices heard, and none did it so loudly as Thomas Macaulay. He circulated a statement known as a Minute on Education, in which he vehemently opposes spending another cent of British money on anything except English education. He wanted to stop funding the printing of books in Arabic, Persian, and so on, and he wanted to withdraw financial support to all but 2 traditional Indian universities. He famously said that, quote, "A single shelf of good European library was worth the whole native literature of India and Arabia." Sounds like a nice guy. Bentinck, who was already strongly in favor of these kinds of reforms, signed off on Macaulay's minute immediately. The reforms suggested by Macaulay came to fruition in the English Education Act of 1835, with one notable exception. Due to passionate protests by the students attending them, no financial support was withdrawn from any traditional college or school. Otherwise, the act made a reality of Macaulay and the Anglicists' goals. Most notably, the act removed Persian as the official administrative language of the land and replaced it with English. And with that, English had finally completed its journey into India. You've probably got a feel already for the level of disdain Thomas Macaulay felt toward Indian culture and learning. Here's a well-known line from his Minute on Education just to make things very clear. In it, he says he wants to create, quote, "a class of persons Indian in blood and color, but English in tastes, in opinions, in morals, and in intellect." The third phase of English's growth in India is the diffusion phase. In this phase, English went from being the language of a conquering corporation and nation to a tool that was used, changed, and developed by the local population, often in ways that were wholly unexpected by their British rulers. The language itself changed. Through contact and convergence, English was absorbing a whole host of words and usages from the South Asian languages it came into contact with. For example, words that are common in English today, like loot, pajama, and bungalow, all have roots in Indian languages. The page you see here on this slide is from the 1886 printing of a dictionary called Hobson-Jobson. Hobson-Jobson is a collection of historical dictionary entries for words and expressions that were used by the Anglo-Indian community. Some of the words are still familiar to us today, but many others have fallen out of fashion, making Hobson-Jobson somewhat of a time capsule when it comes to the English of the Raj. And just as English absorbed Indian languages absorbed English. Words like train, school, bus, and other common English words were quickly absorbed into Hindi, for example. And even the months of the year in Hindi are essentially in English, Sitambara and so on. Concepts and items that were new in India usually became permanently known by their English name. The way English was used in India also changed. Initially, English instruction was sought out so that young Indian men could obtain good administrative jobs with the East India Company or with the Raj. But through the 19th century, English stopped being seen as just a career tool for clerks. It became a language of activism and independence, and a way to connect disparate communities across the country. The following quotes are helpful illustrations of how English helped to create a nation, and thereby aided the weakening of control by the British in India. The Bengali writer Bankim Chandra Chatterjee noted the importance of communication via English. He said, "There's no hope for India until the Bengali and the Punjabi understand and influence one another, and can bring their joint influence to bear upon the Englishman. This can be done only through the medium of English." And A.P. Sen, writing in 1902, was equally cognizant of the advantages English could offer to Indians. He said, "English has forged a link of knowledge and intimacy between the rulers and the ruled, so wide asunder by race and religion. It has developed fellow feelings between the various and strange races of India by creating a common language for them all. It has a tendency to make one nation out of the numerous nations of India. It has rendered Indians more self-respecting than before. It has developed powers of self-government. which it is the professed aim of the British policy to create and nourish. And if this quote makes it sound like he's planning something, consider this. Sen said this in a paper titled, "Does English Education Breed Sedition in India?" Pretty sure we can say the answer was yes. The final phase of English's establishment in India was its institutionalization. In this period, English became a de facto operating language for anyone hoping to join the educated upper classes of Indian society, and seeking an education in English was seen as the standard by India's elite. So what are some signs of English having been institutionalized? The first was the 1835 Education Act, and keep in mind that these phases all overlap by quite a bit, and that the Education Act was a turning point for many aspects of English's entrenchment in India. In 1857, two momentous events occurred in India. The first was the Sepoy Mutiny, a massive uprising against the British that lasted for a year and a half. As a result of this rebellion in 1858, the British Crown took control of the country, wresting power away from the besieged East India Company and giving it instead to Parliament and to Queen Victoria, who became Empress of India in 1876. The other, slightly less dramatic event of 1857 was the founding of 3 universities. These universities, in Bombay, Calcutta, and Madras, were styled after the University of London and were models of English medium higher education. The universities are still considered prestige schools in India today. Finally, a strong sign that English had settled and become a language of state was the enrollment of Indian students at the prestigious Inns of Court in London. The Inns of Court are professional associations for barristers in the United Kingdom, and the first Indian law student admitted to one was Gyanendra Mohan Tagore, who was admitted to Lincoln's Inn and called to the bar in 1859. 30 years later, in 1891, a young lawyer by the name of Mohandas Gandhi would be admitted to the Inner Temple, another of the 4 Inns of Court, to begin his legal career. It's safe to say that by this point, English had fully integrated into Indian society. What started as a language of traders became the language of India's greatest statesmen. In 1947, on the eve of India's independence from Britain, India's first Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, delivered an iconic speech to mark the occasion. Titled "A Tryst with Destiny," the speech was broadcast for the nation and all the world to hear, in English. After a long struggle, India gained her independence in 1947. The years leading up to and following this long-awaited moment were full of tense debates about the future of the new country. One of the most pressing concerns, of course, had to do with language. Members of the Constituent Assembly, tasked with writing India's constitution, nearly came to blows over the issue of which language would be chosen as the nation's official representative. Arguments were made for Hindi, which was eventually named one of the 2 official languages. English, after much debate, was the second. English's case benefited strongly from the arguments and dramatics of assembly members from the south of the country. Unlike in northern India, where Hindi and related languages dominate, southern Indians speak a variety of Dravidian languages, which are wholly unrelated to the Indo-European languages of the north. The Tamil and Telugu-speaking representatives resented Hindi's supremacy, as seen in these remarks by T.T. Krishnamachari, an assembly representative from Madras, and argued that if there were to be any official language, it ought to be one that all Indians could communicate in. English was the compromise. Well, thank you for making it this far. I hope you all found this presentation interesting, and I really appreciate you taking your time and watching and listening. Thanks, everyone.